welcome to the channel. For this video, I'm going to be continuing my exploration of the former site of Boardwalk and Baseball Theme Park. In this video, I'm going to be exploring the Baseball City Stadium complex. I'm also going to take you for a tour of what was left of the barns and stables for the circus performing animals at Circus World theme park. I'm going to show you what was left of the boardwalk that was built for the Boardwalk and Baseball theme park. And finally, I'm going to show you the final demolition of the IMAX Theater. Before I get into all that though, I'm going to first play you a nice little tribute video that I made for Baseball City Stadium. This was a wonderful facility and it is sadly gone now, but it had a good run. The stadium was open for 15 years and, you know, Circus World opened in 1973 and that park would go through a couple iterations, but finally would close in 1990, so it was almost open 20 years. It was a beautiful place to go as a kid. I absolutely loved every minute that I could spend there, and I don't think I would be talking about it 30 years later if it didn't make such an impression on me as a kid. So I hope you enjoyed the video today. So welcome to my part 2 of the exploration of the former Boardwalk and Baseball theme park. And right now I'm standing next to the Baseball City Stadium. This was the former spring training facility for the Kansas City Royals. After Baseball City closed, they moved to Surprise, Arizona. And this was also the home of the minor league baseball team, the Baseball City Royals. Now, back in the day, this whole area of Florida was known as Baseball City. Now it's currently the city of Davenport. Davenport, Florida was the home of a pretty large theme park, and it opened in 1973 as Circus World, which was built by Barnum and Bailey Circus. In 1985, the park was closed and rethemed and reopened in 1987 as Boardwalk and Baseball. So Anheuser Busch bought this park in late 1989 and closed it in January 1990. So when that happened, they summoned all the employees to the IMAX Theater for a big meeting. It was a really ugly, heated meeting because Busch told the employees that the park never turned a profit. The employees knew Busch was lying, and it was just an ugly, ugly scene. HBJ was very open about how profitable the park was in the previous years. Trim hours when they weren't making payroll, but they were giving people extra hours when they were profitable. This park was profitable for most of its existence, and the other gaslighting that Busch claimed during this meeting with employees was There were already too many theme parks in Central Florida, and there just wasn't enough customers for them all. And then they built a bunch of successful theme parks after Busch said that. Universal Studios Florida, Islands of Adventure, Disney's Animal Kingdom, Island H2O, Aquatica, Legoland, Volcano Bay, Epic Universe. Whatever you say, Busch. Whatever you say. It's kind of funny. I didn't realize I filmed my Dodge Dakota hooked up to the U-Haul in this shot. I didn't realize it was on camera. That U-Haul is what I rented to salvage all the pieces from the IMAX Theater. And I grabbed every piece of signage and memorabilia and piece of paperwork and blueprints and whatever wasn't tied down in an IMAX Theater, I salvaged. So that's why I have all this insider information on HBJ Parks, and I can call out Anheuser Busch's lies because I have all the internal financial documents. I've got attendance logs from each year. I've got, all the guest surveys that were filled out by people who were attending the park. Anheuser Busch was just lying. The whole thing was gaslighting. So right now I'm actually standing on the last surviving piece of Boardwalk and Baseball besides the IMAX Theater. This was the boardwalk constructed for the theme park, and this walkway would take you through basically some turnstiles and then an information booth. Basically they were checking to make sure you had paid for park admission, and then you would walk on this boardwalk across and over the Florida Hurricane roller coaster and into the back of the park near the parachute drop ride and the Calypso flat rides. That was right there next to the Florida Hurricane. So heading westbound down this walkway, re-entering the theme park, on your left-hand side would have been a kiddie roller coaster. I believe it was built by Wisdom Rides, and it was called, I think, the Dragon. And then on your right-hand side would have been the Calypso flat ride as well as Das Monster. Now, if you continued on towards this walking path, it would take you past the Santa Maria swinging boat ride, and the Salerno Express restaurant would be on your right-hand side, and then just past that was the Grand Rapids log flume, basically where the end of this walkway would end, and then make a left-hand turn, and it would take you over to the Wild West Show and to the front of the park where the IMAX Theater was. This little incline that I'm walking backwards over right now of the boardwalk, this is where the Florida Hurricane would used to pass under. It was this giant wooden roller coaster that had this little white and blue tunnel that was underneath this walkway, and the riders on the roller coaster would go into the darkness underneath this particular walkway, and it was really cool. And I remember vividly as a kid when I was 10 years old standing on this walkway watching the roller coaster pass under, and the amazing sounds that it made back then was incredible. I mean, nothing sounds quite like a wooden roller coaster. You have to also understand this roller coaster was so fast by Florida standards in 1988. I mean, this thing hit 65 miles an hour back when all the roller coasters at Walt Disney World were doing 24 to 28 miles an hour. I mean, it felt like you were standing still on Big Thunder Mountain and stuff when you were after you took a ride on this particular coaster. This thing that was huge, it was fast, it was the biggest roller coaster in Florida for its entire existence. The only thing that was even remotely close in size was the Starliner out in Panama City Beach. And this roller coaster still survives to this day, even though it was removed from this location. It was reassembled up in Magic Springs Park in Arkansas. Unfortunately, they stopped maintaining that ride within the last 2 or 3 years, so it's just standing but not operating right now. But if you're curious and want to see what the Hurricane was like, go look up the Arkansas Twister. And I got my fingers crossed somebody will buy that park and give that wooden roller coaster the restoration it deserves, because it is one of the best wooden roller coasters that I've ever been on. It was just a classic. It was the first one I ever rode, actually. I sat on this footage a long time, 24 years. It's because this is the one video that I filmed that really still pisses me off to this day. And I'm angry at it because this park was killed needlessly. I've got the balance sheets. They were bringing in millions of dollars in profits every year at Boardwalk and Baseball. The problem is this park was right down the street from what everybody wanted, which was SeaWorld of Orlando. This park was only bringing in like $3 million a year in profits, and everybody wanted SeaWorld, which was bringing in $12 to $15 million worth of profits. So that was the star of HBJ Parks. That was the financial powerhouse. This park was only bringing in, 1.3, 1.2 million guests a year. SeaWorld was doing 4 million. That's the one that everybody wanted. It just was a much more popular park, but it was also in the heart of Orlando, and, Baseball City as well as Cypress Gardens were kind of like away from the tourist corridor. And, they were never going to match SeaWorld's attendance numbers, but, the park president who ran Boardwalk and Baseball, his name was Richard Howard. He's a really good park manager, and he was running this place like a well-oiled machine. They were bringing in millions of dollars in profits. They just weren't bringing tens of millions of dollars in profits. The first year Boardwalk and Baseball was open, they brought in 1.3 million guests. They sold 4.3 million soft drinks and 400,000 hot dogs. I mean, they were definitely making money. They were turning a profit. Anheuser Busch was just stupid. Why would you walk away from things that were making money? I don't understand. They made a $1 billion investment, and they destroyed that investment. They basically divested themselves of theme parks because they just had no idea what they were doing and never really seemed to. There's so much misinformation about these parks out on the internet, and I've been trying to correct them now because it's really starting to bother me how much gaslighting is going on. A lot of the lies were started by Anheuser Busch, and they were just pushing their agenda. They wanted this park closed because of its proximity to Busch Gardens Tampa, and it didn't matter that it was actually a profitable enterprise. They just wanted to kill it, and they succeeded. Well, the crazy part about it in retrospect is Anheuser Busch spent $1.1 billion on 6 theme parks. 3 of the 6 parks that they acquired, they ended up killing, and this was the first one. Anheuser Busch pretty much mismanaged all their theme parks over time and ended up spinning them off and no longer run any of them because they were lousy at it. Unfortunately, the park I'm standing in right now was collateral damage of their incompetence. If you're wondering, the theme parks that managed to survive Anheuser Busch's decades of mismanagement, those parks now belong to United Parks and Resorts. This section of the stadium that I'm standing in right now, I believe was the Stadium Club restaurant. I'm not 100% sure because I never ate here. After the theme park closed, I really never came back to Baseball City Stadium. I felt depressed every time I saw it. I believe they knocked down this Baseball City Stadium in 2004, 2005. I'm walking around it right now towards the end of its run. I believe the final season was 2002. That was the last year that Kansas City Royals used the stadium. You could tell they were already disassembling things here. The gift shop was completely cleared of merchandise, and they're already cutting things apart in the yard, getting it prepped for the conversion into Posner Park. So I didn't talk a lot about Baseball City Stadium. This was a really amazing park, and you have to understand back in the 1980s, this was like the Cadillac of spring training facilities. Nobody ever put this type of money into spring training facilities. I remember growing up at like the baseball stadium where the Fort Lauderdale Yankees used to play, and that place was a ghetto. I mean, it was just cobbled together. I remember going to Florida Miracle games too, and it was basically just chain link fence was the stadium, and they had some bleachers, and this was just such a high-end stadium. I mean, they spent $13 million in like 1986 dollars on this stadium. That's roughly equivalent to about $40 million in today's money. So they spent a ton of money on a ballpark that was mostly used for minor league baseball. Sure, the Kansas City Royals did their spring training here, but the rest of the year it was just a minor league ball club that used this stadium. And it was definitely the nicest stadium of its type pretty much for its entire existence. Nobody in Florida ever built anything like this. It has since inspired a lot of the ball clubs to build better facilities, but You just don't see spring training in Florida anymore. Almost all of the baseball teams have moved out to Arizona now. I mean, the majority of them are out there. And those facilities out in Arizona now rival what Baseball City started. I do feel like Baseball City did inspire those other teams to step up their game and build superior facilities out in Arizona. And, a lot of them have a similar layout to this park with the practice fields beside the stadium. And Disney completely copied them when they built the ESPN Wide World of Sports, about 20 minutes down the street from here. Although I will give Disney some credit, they did scale it up and make it larger with basketball courts and all kinds of other stuff too. I spent the last 30 years crossing paths with various HBJ park execs over the years because I've been in the theme park industry a long time. I've worked at 5 or 6 theme parks, and I've talked to them on Facebook and various places over the years. The whole trick to Boardwalk Baseball and why it was actually making money was the special events. That was basically the lifeblood of this park. The first thing that they will admit is when HBJ built the park, they were hoping for annual attendance around 2 million, and they never quite hit their internal target of 2 million guests a year. But they were consistently bringing in annual attendance of 1.3, 1.2 million a year. The park president had structured Boardwalk Baseball to break even around 750,000 annual guests, so payroll and fixed costs were well under control, and that's why they were turning a nice little profit. So I've got the internal figures for Boardwalk Baseball for 1987 in front of me. They had an annual attendance of 1,325,000 guests in 1987. Now keep in mind, that wasn't even a full year. The park only opened in April. So they did 1.3 million from April through December of 1987. The average per capita spending of each Boardwalk Baseball guest was $25.40. So gross revenues just from the per capita spending comes out to about $33,600,000. I'd now like to point out that that per capita spending only covered food, concessions, and merchandise. It did not include front gate admission or annual passes. In 1987, Boardwalk Baseball generated an additional $18 million selling annual passes to the 3 HBJ parks as well as front gate admission. So they pulled in more than $50 million in gross revenue for their opening season. And keep in mind, 2 years later, they were going to open a baseball stadium next to this theme park, which would generate additional millions in revenue. This was a great business that was completely squandered by a new owner that had no idea what they were looking at. The marketing department at Boardwalk Baseball was, they were charting the park out for some of these tour groups. They were making $50,000, $75,000 in a single day off of just a single tour group. They would basically book the stadium. They would book the IMAX Theater for private showings. They would book the restaurants and catering, and they were making profits on every single level of that chartering of the park. They were basically, how the Disney Worlds and Universals they rent out the parks for the Night of Joy and Grad Night and stuff. Well, that's how Boardwalk Baseball was making all this money. They were turning a profit by renting the park out for special events, and that's where all the money was coming from. I really am angry that Anheuser Busch has been lying for the last 30 years about this crap, because it's a bunch of nonsense. The park was making money. This park was right down the street from Busch Gardens Tampa Bay, and that's why they killed this thing. I still can't believe Anheuser Busch would piss away such a huge investment. I mean, HBJ pumped millions into this park. It was a flagship for them. They started out by buying the park in 1984 for $18 million. Then they spent $22 million redoing the theme, turning it into Boardwalk Baseball. So it's a $40 million park already. And then they spent an additional $13 million on a baseball stadium. So, I mean, it was about a $55 million investment back in 1986. They just bulldozed the whole thing, even though they were turning in, $3 to $5 million profits each year. They didn't care. Busch didn't care. And as a kid, who went to Busch Gardens and Boardwalk and Baseball around the same time, I can safely say that Boardwalk and Baseball was the nicer looking park. Busch Gardens at the time was just some concrete on the ground and haphazard landscaping, and their roller coasters are tiny. I mean, they had the Scorpion and the Python back then, and they were both lame next to the Hurricane. I mean, Boardwalk and Baseball had the better roller coaster, and I mean, everything was a wooden boardwalk, and the landscaping was superior. I mean, they spent so much more time and effort making the park look nice. Boardwalk and Baseball had those classic antique style lanterns throughout the park, and I think they were powered by like heating oil and stuff. They had the old like flickering just to add to that traditional like Americana nostalgia. The Grand Rapids was the largest log flume in Florida at the time, and it definitely made Stanley, and don't get me wrong, I loved Stanley Falls as a kid, but Stanley Falls looked old and tired even back in 1988, especially when there was this concrete reinforced brand new log flume at Boardwalk and Baseball. So when HBJ Parks was forced to sell their theme park holdings in 1989, it was caused by an averted hostile takeover. It had nothing to do with the theme parks. As I mentioned in the previous video, all 6 theme parks were making an annual profit. The theme parks were pretty much keeping HBJ alive by using those profits just to service the crazy bank loans. I mean, HBJ was $3 billion in debt. They were in really dire shape by about 1989. There were 4 companies all trying to buy the HBJ theme parks, but all of them just wanted the 4 SeaWorld parks. And HBJ was insistent that they're going to sell all the parks to raise the absolute maximum amount of money. And, you know, they originally wanted like $2 billion for all the stuff, and you know, all the bidders balked at that figure, and it ended up, you know, Anheuser Busch was the highest bidder at $1.1 billion. Now, a lot of people don't realize that the other companies trying to buy the parks was Walt Disney Company. They also desired SeaWorld. They made a big play for them. There was, I think it was the Florida Leisure Company, which at the time owned Silver Springs theme park. And there was a 4th private equity company, but the name escapes me right now. I don't remember which one it was. What's neat about this situation is I had pretty much unfettered access to all these facilities here at Baseball City, as well as Boardwalk and Baseball. So a lot of these areas, I'm in like employee only areas that probably a lot of fans of Baseball City never got to see. You know, walking around like the locker rooms and the mezzanines and the electrical rooms set up for the big stadium lighting. It is kind of neat to, you know, savor this place and just appreciate just the size and scale of the stadium. This stadium was so big. And now I'm going to release some insider information about Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. This stadium was designed specifically so it could be easily upside into a full Major League Baseball stadium. They only built phase 1 of the stadium. It was designed so they could build an addition onto the back and triple the seating capacity from like 7,000 to close to 30,000 seats. When William Jovanovich was designing Boardwalk and Baseball, it was always his intention to bring Major League Baseball to Orlando. Central Florida would eventually get their own Major League Baseball team in the Tampa Bay Rays, but William Jovanovich built this stadium to lure Major League Baseball to Baseball City. Had they still been in control of Boardwalk and Baseball when that all happened, I could definitely have seen the Tampa Bay Rays actually being the Baseball City Devil Rays instead. I think that is very possible what would have happened if this park was still around by that point. don't think I can emphasize enough just what a big deal this ballpark was back in 1988 when it opened. Back in that time frame, there was just no other baseball stadium built in Florida that was this nice. I mean, most of the baseball stadiums built down here were afterthoughts and city parks that were kind of retrofitted into stadiums. This was the first baseball stadium built down here that had similar construction standards to like a Shea Stadium or a Fenway Park. I mean, it was just so much bigger and better than everything else at the time. Let's face it, HBJ Parks hasn't existed since 1989, and people are still talking about them because their park operations were amazing. You know, they never held back. They were never half-assed any attraction. You know, they put in so much effort into maintenance. I do think even now, their maintenance was up to Disney standards, and everybody else was way behind. I remember, 1990 when Universal Studios first opened, and their park operations were a mess. And heck, Epic Universe just opened, and their park operations are still kind of a mess. You know, they're having trouble with keeping the rides running properly. But in 1990, when you went to Universal Studios Florida, they were struggling. You know, the garbage cans were overflowing, and the rides were constantly breaking down. I remember I rode Kongfrontation 3 times in one day, and it broke down all 3 times I was on the ride. So there were certain rides that were just notoriously bad for downtime, and I remember Earthquake having all kinds of problems too when it first opened. I mean, that first year at Universal Studios, I think the only ride that they could get running reliably was E.T., because it was a simpler ride mechanism. It was just like an Omni Mover style dark ride. So I filmed this footage sometime around 2002. It was right after the final baseball games were played here at Baseball City when the Royals left. You can tell it's been a couple months since the Royals played here because the baseball field is already overgrown, and they had already started to remove some of the stadium seats from the baseball stadium. What's kind of interesting is this baseball field kind of evolved over the years. Baseball City Stadium was open 15 years. When they had first built it, the infield was actually built out of artificial turf, and the outfield was grass. I'm not sure what year they switched over, but you can tell now that they went exclusively to real grass. I talked to some of the ball players who used to play here, and they used to complain about how fast the balls would bounce and take bad hops off of the artificial turf on the infield. And there were a lot of errors in the gameplay because of that. I believe the Kansas City Royals played exclusively on artificial turf in their home stadium up in Kansas City, and that's why their spring training facility also had the artificial turf down here. As someone who was born and raised in Florida, I suspect they had to remove the artificial turf because the sun just tears everything up down here. And I remember my grandparents having like that fake awful turf on their back porch. After about 2 or 3 years, it would just fade and just completely fall apart. So it was probably cheaper just to go to the organic grass. Right now, I'm looking out to one of the practice fields of the Baseball City Sports Complex. When this facility was constructed, this was the largest spring training facility for any Major League Baseball team in the United States at the time. It sat on about 25 acres and consisted of 6 baseball fields. 4 of them were practice fields. There was a small stadium that was mostly used for like Little League expositions and tournaments. And then they had the main baseball stadium, which was Baseball City. So what you're looking at right now are the old area of the theme park that was dedicated to the Wild West show. This is, I believe, the backstage area where they cared for the various animals that performed in the rodeo show. I believe this particular complex was built for when it was Circus World theme park because I remember the Wild West show back when I went to Circus World, I think in 1984, maybe 85, something like that. So the very first Wild West show at Circus World was called The Great Western Stampede. I do remember it being a pretty great production, and I think the show time on that one was about 25 minutes long. When the park was rethemed into Boardwalk and Baseball, the Wild West show was expanded and became more elaborate with more gunfights and stunts, tumbling, taking high falls off of the roofs. That expanded show ran more like 40 minutes long. I do remember the Boardwalk and Baseball version of this Wild West show a lot better. When the park opened in 1987, it was the Colorado Riders Show, and it was definitely the most elaborate stage production I probably ever saw at a theme park. They had like 30 or 40 different animals and probably like 25 different performers, and they did all kinds of stunts, like standing on the back of horses and stuff, and there were gunfights, and they had people falling off of like the tops of the Wild West town and all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, it was really big and elaborate. HBJ was trying to turn a profit, and I think it was a bigger production than they could afford to produce on a daily basis. They shrunk the Wild West show down to the Lipizzan Stallions in, I think, 1989. It was the last year they changed the show to the Lipizzan Stallions. What I always found kind of funny, Boardwalk and Baseball produced that tourist video that I have already posted on YouTube, and they were showing a bunch of scenes from the Colorado Riders. But by the time they released that VHS tape, that particular show was already gone, and it was just the Lipizzan Stallions. And I do think it was a downgraded, production trying to cut costs, because they had maybe a half dozen Lipizzan Stallions and like 2 or 3 performers, talking about the horses and stuff. It was a much smaller production than Colorado Riders, and I always felt like it was just a cost-cutting move. Now, this area that I'm walking around right now is probably where the grave sites for all the animals are. As I mentioned in the first video of the series, in the IMAX Theater exploration, when the animals passed away at Circus World, they just kind of buried them out in the field here. So there's a bunch of skeletons for elephants and bears and horses and tigers and pretty much any animal that performed at Barnum and Bailey Circus that passed away from anywhere from 1973 to 1985. They're all out here somewhere in the ground. I don't think I would want my apartment sitting on top of this land personally, but that's where they decided to build the Posner Park apartments. So they're sitting on a bunch of dead animals. And I've seen enough Stephen King movies like Pet Sematary to know that that's not where I would build my particular house. I realized in 1989 Universal Studios was, basically just in their infancy in Central Florida, and they probably weren't very sure of themselves yet. I really wish Universal had purchased Boardwalk Baseball and SeaWorld instead of Anheuser Busch. If you look at the long-term legacy of Anheuser Busch, they basically killed half of the theme parks they ever owned. There used to be 4 Busch Gardens parks, now there's 2. They purchased 6 theme parks from HBJ, and they managed to kill 3 of them. Half of the theme parks that Anheuser-Busch touched would die. Meanwhile, Universal has grown their attendance successfully for decades. They've doubled their theme park attendance at Islands Adventure and Universal over the last 20 years. Disney is down about 10 million guests in that time frame, and Universal is up more than 10 million. So they've been kind of pulling guests away from, Disney over the last 25 years. I genuinely believe that, Universal would have built Islands Adventure and Epic Universe if Universal had also purchased SeaWorld and Boardwalk and Baseball in 1989. They'd have 5 gates right now versus Walt Disney World's 4. And I really do believe that Universal would have overtaken Disney by now as number 1 in Florida. So these giant steel letters were out by the practice fields. I am only going by a very foggy memory, but I believe these blue letters spelled out Boardwalk and Baseball, and used to be in the this huge garden that was kind of cut into the side of a hill, located in the parking lot area. So I remember there was this little photo vantage point in the parking lot, and if I vaguely recall, the parking lot tram used to stop there at this giant Boardwalk and Baseball garden because the parking lot was on like multiple elevation changes, and I don't think the parking lot tram used to take people up the hill. I believe it would drop you off and you'd have to walk up the walkway to the upper level of parking. And that was the parking lot closest to Interstate 4. You know, the lower main parking lot would look up to this garden area. And it was all right in the vicinity. There was a Hardee's restaurant that was kind of like in the middle of the Boardwalk and Baseball parking lot. It was a little kind of awkward, but you know, the Hardee's was here before Boardwalk and Baseball was built. I believe Circus World had sold that little commercial parcel to Hardee's restaurant, and they built a Hardee's right there in basically where the Circus World parking lot was. I actually crossed paths with a fellow fan of like Boardwalk and Baseball. I was out here filming, and you can see him walking around in a couple shots because we both had permission to explore the property. This was like I said, 24 years ago. I can't remember his name or his email address. I completely misplaced it when I relocated and moved to a different house. But if you were the cool guy who used to own a DeLorean, you know, shoot me an email. You can just click on the top of the page to get contact information, because it'd be great to catch up and talk to you again. I remember you used to have a great website dedicated to abandoned tourist attractions, and we spent all day talking about Xanadu that used to be in Kissimmee. And like I said, for the life of me, I can't remember your contact information. So please reach out. It'd be great to touch base again. In some of this footage, you're going to see residential like dormitories. From what I understand, a lot of the circus performers used to live here at Circus World Park. You know, a lot of the animal handlers and stuff, they lived next to the barns and those type of stuff. And I believe these dormitories were also used by a lot of the minor league baseball players all through about 1993. That's when they, I think, sold off the Baseball City Royals ball club. When you're walking around the remnants of this theme park, the dormitories are definitely the building in the worst shape. You can tell that those buildings haven't been cared for like a decade. You know, this was, you know, like I said, I was filming this around 2000, 2001. And the dormitories, the walls were like peeling off and the insulation was showing. And, you know, there were curtains flying out in the wind because the windows had shattered and stuff. So the dormitories were definitely the structures on property that were in the worst shape. Even though like the animal barns weren't used in the same amount of time, they were holding up pretty good. I guess they were built a little better than the dormitories, because I mean, a lot of the dormitories, they look like they were thrown together quickly. A lot of mobile home components when they were building them. You know, mobile homes down here in Florida with all the tropical storms and everything, they just get ripped apart and fall apart. So the dorms were definitely the one section of this park that really, really looked sad and forlorn. And I'm not surprised they were torn down so quickly. So this backstage area that I'm in right now of the former theme park, this was the former employee parking lot for both Boardwalk and Baseball as well as Circus World. I believe the smaller office building that was located off this parking lot was like the employee check-in point, where some of the employees would fill out and punch in on their time cards. Boardwalk and Baseball had about 700 employees, so I doubt they all used the same time clock. I have a feeling they had a couple locations. I believe some of the employees were also using time clocks inside the IMAX building as well as the baseball stadium. If I remember right, there was also a smaller employee lot behind like the Dance USA pavilion on the north side of the park that was close to Interstate 4. Some of the employees used to check in on that side of the park just so they didn't have to walk across the 150 acres from the employee lot that was located on the south side. So right now I'm standing in front of the IMAX building in what was the original main parking lot for Boardwalk and Baseball. This is where most of the guests would come through the park. When you're facing the IMAX building, off to my right-hand side, that's where the dog kennels were located. So obviously, for Boardwalk and Baseball as well as Circus World, pets weren't allowed inside the theme park. All the guests who had household pets that brought them on vacation, they would check them in at that little tiny building that was off to the right-hand side of the IMAX Theater, and that's how they would start their day. Now, the main park entrance, the ones where the turnstiles and the ticket sales were, that was located all the way to the left side of the IMAX building. I really do have great memories of this parking lot as a kid. Boardwalk and Baseball does make a great first impression, as well as Circus World, when you were first coming into the theme park. That IMAX building and like the big top before it were just a massive structure. It was the focal point of the park when you first came in. That and when it was Boardwalk and Baseball, they had that giant Grand Rapids log flume also right in the front of the park, kind of drawing your eye into it. The IMAX Theater for this park was a lot like the Spaceship Earth Dome at Epcot or Cinderella's Castle at Magic Kingdom. It was their signature attraction that was right at the front of the park that basically defined the whole day. I mean, it was iconic. The other thing that was interesting about Boardwalk and Baseball was even their parking lot trams were themed. When you went to Magic Kingdom or Epcot, it was the same trams that they had those industrial-looking parking lot trams, and they're nice in their own regard. But in Boardwalk and Baseball, they picked you up in trams that looked like streetcars. The park was inspired by the old school trolley parks and amusement parks from like the early 1900s and late 1800s. So even the trams looked like streetcars. It was really cool. So walking around this parking lot, the one thing that I remember seeing back when I was a kid was the Hardys. At some point, Hardee's had bought an out parcel here in the middle of the Boardwalk and Baseball and Circus World parking lot. I know Hardee's was open the entire time it was Boardwalk and Baseball. I have a feeling Circus World might have sold off that parcel during the construction of Circus World, or maybe trying to raise money like in the early 80s. I'm not sure when it became a Hardee's. That Hardee's had been knocked down when I was filming in 2002, so I think it went out of business probably around 97 or 98, because this section of Highway 27 really was a dead zone after the park closed. You have to remember, Boardwalk and Baseball and Circus World were the single largest employer in all of Polk County at the time. So Anheuser Busch really did devastate the economy here for a long time, and even now, I don't think it really completely recovered. Posner Park is mostly a residential community. I mean, they do have some stores and restaurants up front next to the Highway 27, but it definitely didn't create anywhere near the jobs that the theme park once did. When they knocked down the Hardee's that was in the parking lot here at Boardwalk and Baseball, they did rebuild a new Hardee's in Davenport. It's about 3.5 miles south of here on Highway 27 in the St. Charles Plaza. I believe this little gray building here that's at the foot of the IMAX Theater, I'm pretty sure that this is where the customer service desk was for accessing the pet kennels. So the covered building I'm in right now was clearly where the pet kennels were located. They would have had a bunch of cages in here where they, would store the cats and dogs throughout the day. And that little basin in the bottom of the floor is, they would hose out the cages at the end of each shift and clean them out because, the pets were not happy to be caged, and they would go poo-poo and pee-pee, and, that would fall to the bottom of the ground through the cages, and like I said, they would just hose it out at the end of each shift. Watching these old theme park videos kind of makes me a little depressed. You have to understand, back in the 1990s, Walt Disney World wasn't putting talking automobiles in the Wild West at Magic Kingdom, or retheming a mountain-based water ride after the city of New Orleans, or putting aliens in the science-themed section of Epcot. The Disney Imagineers back then weren't completely retarded. When you look at the regression we've made at the theme parks over the last 25 years, it's just been tough to watch for longtime fans. The Disney parks were really pretty much at their peak in the 90s. The daily admission price was the equivalent of $75 in today's prices, so it was a lot more affordable too. And speaking of affordability, daily admission to Cypress Gardens back then was the equivalent of $27 today. Name one theme park where you can get into for $27 for the day in Central Florida. It doesn't exist. Cypress Gardens was the better park with more mass appeal than Legoland Florida. I don't know why Legoland is relentlessly designing their parks around 12-year-old children and younger, but that's only 15% of the population. When you go to a Legoland, 85% of the demographics of the United States are bored out of their mind because it's just kiddie shit. Cypress Gardens will always be better because they actually had attractions that also appeal to adults. It was actually a family theme park, unlike the toddler theme park that Legoland Florida is. So you'll notice that there's been a time jump now. This video footage you're watching now is like 3 months after the previous footage on this video, when I was exploring the IMAX Theater and the Baseball City Stadium and the grounds. That was, I want to say in the summertime, maybe the fall, and this was early spring where they were taking down the building, if I recall. It was brutal watching the IMAX building come down, because that was my childhood, just watching it get bulldozed. But, like I said, Kitson Partners invited me to come out and watch it and I guess have some closure, saying my final goodbyes to this theme park. I'm incredibly grateful to them for being so cool about everything and letting me save the pieces from the IMAX Theater that I was able to. This was an abandoned piece of property by the time they came along and redeveloped it into something that's usable as Posner Park. And I place all the blame on Anheuser Busch. They're the ones that actually killed this place. And I hope they're aware that they did lasting damage. There's a lifelong boycott of Anheuser Busch products in my household. My family had boycotted Busch Gardens as well as SeaWorld parks for the entire time that Anheuser Busch owned them. And we only started going back to those parks after they had divested themselves from any involvement with those theme parks. So we've only started going to SeaWorld and Busch Gardens after 2010. And it was somewhat fascinating watching the building come down because, some of the original 1973 portions of the wall were visible again. You could actually see the red and white circus tent paint job, underneath the 1986 renovations. So it was kind of like a mixed blessing to see this thing come down because I had a better understanding of how they made the additions onto the back of the property. From this vantage point, you can also see the black mounting points on the roof where all those Norman Rockwell reproduction paintings were mounted. And just remember, those paintings were 80 feet tall, just for some scale of how huge that building was. And they had 4 of them on each side of the roof. So there were 4 facing the parking lot and 4 facing the theme park. The IMAX building could accommodate, I think, over 2,000 people. It was a big damn building. There was 3 stories inside. The IMAX Theater could hold 600 people at once. The TV studio next door held another 500 people, give or take. And then the restaurant on the first floor and the gift shops had another capacity of probably about 200, 250 people, something like that. And then, they had the 2 stories of corporate offices upstairs. I think it held about 2,000 people at full capacity. It was a big damn building. So if you're not familiar with the Boardwalk and Baseball layout, I'm standing east of the IMAX Theater right now, which would be on the ground where the theme park was located. I'm standing roughly in the ballpark of where the Wild West Arena was located. To my right-hand side would have been the vintage carousel. That would have been the next thing to my right-hand side. And then just beyond that was the Grand Rapid log flume. When the log flume was built here in 1986, it was the world's largest log flume ever created. And I believe that record probably still stands because all the log flumes that really have been built since then, like Splash Mountain and like Journey to Atlantis, all those things, they were themed rides, and this was like an old school amusement park version of the log flume. So I don't think anyone's ever built a larger log flume like a traditional unthemed log flume. Now, sitting in front of that Grand Rapids log flume were a couple of railroad dining cars that were configured into a restaurant, and that was known as the Salerno Express restaurant. And if I remember right, they served Italian food. I remember eating at that restaurant all the time. My parents loved the food in there. We used to love watching people come down the log flume from inside the restaurant. It had a great vantage point, so you could see, everyone coming down like the main final drop. And there was a pretty big splash area. It didn't splash the restaurant per se, but if you would have walked up that boardwalk path near the log flume, you could definitely get sprayed from that splashdown. I think it was the first drop that splashed the boardwalk, if I remember right, and it was the second drop that was over by the train car, the restaurant. So I still have the blueprints for that Aero flume, and it was purchased for $2 million in 1986, which is the equivalent of about a $6 million ride in today's dollars. Since they're knocking down the IMAX Theater, I guess I should probably talk to you about what an IMAX film is all about. And the first thing I'll say is the IMAX films when I was a kid were a lot better than what they call IMAX nowadays. They've kind of watered it down, and a lot of times they will just make an IMAX movie screen just, I think 30 or 40 feet taller than a traditional movie theater screen nowadays. Back in the day, like this particular IMAX theater at Circus World and Boardwalk Baseball, it actually was dug 6 stories down into the ground because an IMAX theater back then made the actual projection screen 6 stories high. The walkways in the IMAX theaters back then were the steepest you'll ever experience. I mean, it went straight down. It was brutal. It actually freaked me out when I was a kid because it was almost like walking down a ladder. I know the Barnum and Bailey people did this deliberately. They made the building look fairly, small on the outside from the outward appearance. It only looks like a 3-story building. And then you would get inside of it and you realize that it went down 6 stories into the ground. So the real height of the building was actually 8 stories tall, even though it only looked like a 3-story building on the outside. So that was definitely a sleight of hand that was intentional. Nowadays, there's probably not a lot of people that are aware that there was actually a TV studio located inside this building as well. They had filmed a couple seasons of a trivia show for ESPN inside this building, in the Studio One soundstage that was next to the IMAX Theater. And like I said earlier, the IMAX Theater held 600 people. The TV studio held about 500. I'm pretty confident that I probably wouldn't have gotten into the film industry and TV if it weren't for my early experiences at this park, watching them film the TV show for ESPN here. That was pretty much the first time I ever saw anyone film a TV show here in Florida. As someone who lived in this area for several years, I don't think you can ever articulate how much long-term damage Anheuser Busch did to Polk County. When they destroyed this park, there were a lot of restaurants that went out of business, and quite a few of the hotels collapsed from the lack of visitors in this corridor. It caused about a decade and a half long recession here in Polk County. Other employers have since filled the gaps and have helped the county recover. I know Polk County schools and now Publix employ more people than Boardwalk and Baseball did back in the 80s, but it took a long time to fix the damage done by Anheuser Busch. What really boggles the mind about this park for me is the park only was open for 2 years and 8 months. That's an incredibly short amount of time. It had barely finished the construction phase when they shut it for good. Like in 1989, they put up a brand new Ferris wheel. They replaced it with one of the largest ones in the United States. The baseball stadium was barely finished. I mean, it opened in late 88 and the park was out of business January 1990. So the baseball stadium was only open for maybe a year. Anheuser Busch just didn't care. As I mentioned earlier, the park was bringing in a modest profit, and it really doesn't surprise me that Anheuser Busch doesn't run a single theme park now, because they would just piss away these profitable business ventures until they had nothing left. Another great example of Busch Gardens' incompetence, let's take a look at Busch Gardens Houston. They built it in May 1971 and closed it in December 1972. Busch spent $12 million in 1971 to build this theme park and then closed it a year and a half later. $12 million back then is worth about $86 million today. I can't imagine pissing away that much money, and it just explains why Anheuser Busch doesn't own a single theme park nowadays. Just absolute incompetence, and that's the greatest example of history repeating themselves. The same debacle with Busch Gardens Houston was like Boardwalk and Baseball in the 1980s. Same kind of thing. Both of those parks should be around right now, and can you imagine if Busch Gardens Houston was still around after Astroworld closed? I mean, it would be thriving right now. And the same for Boardwalk and Baseball. Had they lured in the Major League Baseball team that they had planned to, the Tampa Bay Rays actually played at Baseball City, history would have been completely different. So when HBJ Parks went out of business, it was kind of the death of affordable theme parks in Central Florida. In 1989 to 1990, a single-day admission to Walt Disney World would run about $31. By comparison, a single-day admission to SeaWorld was only $22, so they were undercutting Disney by $10. Boardwalk and Baseball was about half the price of a ticket to Walt Disney World. They were priced at around $16 for daily admission. And Cypress Gardens was even cheaper still. They were roughly one-third the price of a single-day admission to Walt Disney World. A daily admission to Cypress Gardens during this era was about $11.50 for adults. No theme park in Central Florida does that anymore. They're all pretty much in the same price parity. If you go to Walt Disney World or Universal Studios or SeaWorld or Busch Gardens, the daily admission price is all close together. I mean, they might undercut Disney by $5, maybe $10 for the day. They're all charging the same crazy daily admission rates. And not only that, but they have rapidly raised the prices at Walt Disney World and Universal. They're way above what inflation would dictate nowadays. Back in 1990, that $31 admission price translates to about $75 for the day in today's money. If you go and try to buy a single-day admission to Walt Disney World nowadays, it will cost you around $200 on a peak day, which is crazy. You know, like I said, the tickets in the 90s were the equivalent of about $75 in today's dollars. So they have been rapidly raising prices much faster than inflation would support. And then if you add a park hopper on top of that $200 daily rate, it comes out to like $293. It's just sheer insanity for single day admission. I mean, they are so much more expensive than they used to be. I just don't think people realize what we lost in Central Florida when HBJ Parks went away. They were the ones keeping Disney honest. Nobody is giving Disney any price competition anymore. When Walt Disney World raises their admission prices, all the other theme parks in town just follow them to the same levels. HBJ just had a different mindset. They wanted to be the affordable option in town. So one of the things that I'm going to point out in some of this very last demolition footage is the concrete foundation for the IMAX Theater is still intact and still underneath the ground. When they were constructing this IMAX Theater in 1973, the concrete footers went down at least 100 feet. That's what the demolition guys told me here at the property at 2002. It just wasn't viable to break all the concrete up because of how far down it went. The IMAX Theater did go down 6 stories into the ground, and I believe they were able to break up the first 20 feet of it or so that was like visible above the ground, but that last 40 feet of IMAX Theater is still there underneath the ground. The concrete footers that support the weight of the building, they're all still on this location too. I believe Dick's Sporting Goods is now sitting on the location where the IMAX Theater is in Posner Park. So it wouldn't be particularly easy to uncover that old IMAX building foundation because I think they built a foundation on top of it. But it's still there. The IMAX Theater is still kind of partially submerged in the ground at Posner Park.